The cabin had always existed in my life as a story, not a place. A lakeside property my uncle kept quiet about, mentioned only in passing, like a memory he didn't want crowded by opinions. When I inherited it, the paperwork felt heavier than the keys. Not because of the value, but because of the silence around it. No fanfare. No warnings. Just a deed, a will, and a note in his handwriting telling me to take my time before visiting. I arrived on a weekday morning, the kind where the lake sits flat and reflective, like it's holding its breath. The cabin was modest, with siding weathered by years of sun and water, a small dock stretching into the lake, trees wrapping around it like a shield. It didn't look like something anyone would fight over. That should have been my first clue. I hadn't been there 10 minutes before I noticed a woman standing near the tree line on the neighboring property. Arms crossed.
Sunglasses on.
Watching. I waved, out of habit more than friendliness. She didn't wave back. She turned and walked toward her house, phone already in her hand. I shrugged it off and started unloading my truck. As I was unlocking the cabin door, I heard a car pull up behind me. Then another. 2 police cruisers stopped on the narrow gravel road, lights flashing but siren silent. The contrast against the peaceful lake was jarring, like a mistake in the scenery. An officer stepped out and asked if I was the property owner. I told him yes. He asked for identification. I handed it over without hesitation. That's when she appeared again, standing confidently behind them, pointing toward the cabin as if she'd rehearsed it. "That's him," she said. He broke in. The officer turned back to me, polite but firm. He explained they'd received a call reporting trespassing and illegal occupancy. I calmly told him the cabin was mine, inherited, and that I'd just arrived that morning. He asked for proof. I said it was in the truck. That seemed reasonable enough until she interrupted. "He can say anything," she snapped. "That cabin has been empty for years. We all know it belongs to the county now." The county. That word hung in the air, unsupported by anything else. I glanced at the officers. One of them raised an eyebrow slightly, the universal expression for "we'll see about that." I retrieved the folder from my truck and handed over the deed copy and probate documents. They didn't rush. They read. She didn't like that. "I already explained this to dispatch," she said sharply. "This land is part of a conservation easement. Outsiders can't just show up and claim it." Outsider. Another assumption. Another reach. The older officer looked at her and asked a simple question. "Ma'am, what's your name?" She gave it proudly, followed immediately by her address and how long she'd lived there, as if longevity equaled authority. She explained she was deeply involved in local matters and that she was protecting community property. Every sentence ended like a verdict. The officer nodded, then turned back to me. "We'll need to verify the documents," he said. "Just routine." I agreed. I had nothing to hide. What I didn't need to say yet, was that my uncle had anticipated exactly this kind of confrontation. The quiet cabin. The empty years. The assumption that absence meant abandonment. He had prepared for neighbors who confused familiarity with ownership. As the officer stepped aside to make calls, she crossed her arms again, satisfaction creeping into her posture. She thought this was going exactly as planned. She thought the presence of police meant she'd already won. Standing there by the lake, with sunlight cutting through the trees and the water lapping gently at the dock, I realized something important. This wasn't about the cabin. It never had been. It was about who people think they can push when they believe no one important is watching. And she had no idea who she'd just called the police on. The officers moved a few steps away, radios low, voices measured. I could tell they weren't treating this as a routine eviction anymore. The paperwork had shifted the tone. Still, the Karen didn't retreat. She hovered close enough to listen, close enough to remind everyone she was in control. She kept glancing at me, like she expected me to crack under the pressure of uniforms and flashing lights. "I've lived here 15 years, she announced unprompted. "That cabin's been empty the whole time. Everyone knows it reverted back. We use the shoreline. Kids swim there. Boats dock there." One officer looked at her. "Ma'am, empty doesn't mean unowned." She scoffed. "That's not how it works around here." That phrase told me everything. Around here, local rules, unwritten power, the belief that long presence overrides law. My uncle had warned me about places like this, where people confuse comfort with control. I stayed quiet, not because I was nervous, but because silence lets other people reveal how much rope they're holding. The younger officer came back first. Dispatch says the parcel is still listed under the estate, he said. No county ownership on record. Her head snapped toward him. That's outdated. Those systems lag. The older officer didn't even look at her this time.
He turned to me.
Sir, do you have any additional documentation? Tax records, surveys. I do, I said, and handed over another folder. My uncle had been thorough. Annual tax receipts, boundary surveys, a notarized letter explaining the property's limited access rights. The officer flipped through it slowly, nodding as he went. Her confidence started to wobble. This is ridiculous, she said. I called because he doesn't belong here. He's not part of this community. That word again. Belong. The officer finally addressed her directly. Ma'am, calling the police to remove someone requires more than a feeling. Right now, his documentation checks out. Her voice rose. So, you're just going to let him stay? We're not removing a legal property owner, he replied. The lake was still. A breeze moved through the trees. Everything felt calm except her. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice like that made it private. You should leave while you still can, she said. People here don't like troublemakers. I met her eyes. I'm not going anywhere. The officers exchanged a look. The older one cleared his throat. Ma'am, unless you have evidence of a crime, we're done here. She looked stunned. I pay taxes here.
So does he, the officer said.
That should have ended it. It didn't. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling furiously. I'm calling someone, she said. This isn't over. The officers warned her about misuse of emergency services. She waved them off. As the cruisers pulled away, she stayed planted at the edge of the property, watching me like a threat that needed managing. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside, the smell of old wood and lake air filling the room. My uncle's presence was everywhere. The chairs, the photos, the quiet intention. I understood then why he told me to take my time. This place didn't just come with land and water. It came with people who thought they could decide, who deserved it. And judging by the way she stood outside, phone in hand, staring at the door, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning proved her warning wasn't idle. I woke to the sound of an engine idling too close to the cabin, the low rumble carrying across the still water. When I stepped outside, a white county vehicle was parked near the dock, hazard lights blinking. Two men in reflective vests stood by the shoreline, taking photos and pointing at the waterline like they were measuring something invisible. They introduced themselves as environmental compliance officers responding to a report about unauthorized occupancy and shoreline misuse. The phrasing was careful, neutral, almost apologetic. I didn't argue. I asked who filed the report. They didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. I retrieved the same folder again, adding another document my uncle had labeled, just in case. It outlined the permitted use of the shoreline, signed and approved years earlier. One of the officers read it twice, then handed it to the other. Their shoulders relaxed almost immediately.
This checks out, one of them said.
You're within compliance. They apologized for the inconvenience and left without issuing so much as a warning. As their vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, I noticed her watching from across the trees, phone pressed to her ear, posture rigid with frustration. By midday, the calls started. Not to me directly, but around me. The local marina asked if I was planning construction. I wasn't. A neighbor knocked, politely, to ask how long I intended to stay. Indefinitely, I said. He nodded slowly, processing that answer like it changed something fundamental. That afternoon, I received an email from a community liaison. It welcomed me, cautiously, and asked if I'd be open to discussing shared access to the dock. The tone was friendly but rushed, like someone trying to smooth over a mess before it spread. I didn't reply. What she didn't realize was that every call, every inspection, Every message was building a pattern. My uncle had taught me that authority doesn't announce itself. It documents. And while she was escalating emotionally, I was escalating procedurally. On the third day, she crossed a line. I returned from town to find a notice taped to the cabin door claiming the structure was subject to immediate review due to ownership ambiguity. It looked official at a glance. It wasn't. The letterhead was outdated. The language was sloppy. And the signature belonged to someone who no longer held that position. That night, I made a call of my own. Not to confront. Not to threaten.
Just to clarify.
By morning, the clarification had traveled faster than any rumor she could spread. When she showed up again, this time without police or officials, her confidence was gone. She tried a different approach. Softer voice. Concerned smile. She talked about misunderstandings and community harmony. She suggested mediation. I listened, then told her calmly that any further contact would need to go through legal channels. Her face hardened. "You think you're untouchable," she said. I shook my head.
No.
"I'm just prepared." She left without another word.
No calls followed that day.
Or the next. The lake returned to its quiet rhythm, the kind that makes conflict feel temporary and small. Sitting on the dock that evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, I finally understood the real inheritance. It wasn't the cabin. It wasn't the land. It was the foresight to know that some people mistake silence for weakness and paperwork for obstacles, never realizing that both can be the strongest defenses you'll ever need. By the end of the week, the pressure shifted from visible confrontation to quiet maneuvering, which was far more telling. No more police cars. No more inspectors. Instead, there were emails copied to too many recipients, meetings scheduled without agendas, and neighbors suddenly eager to introduce themselves. People who had ignored the cabin for years now wanted conversations, assurances, cooperation. The tone wasn't hostile anymore. It was cautious. The first formal letter arrived on Friday afternoon. It came from a regional legal office representing a community interest group. Carefully worded, professionally formatted, and deliberately vague. It acknowledged my ownership while proposing a discussion about mutual benefit arrangements and historical usage accommodations. In simpler terms, they wanted access without admitting they had no right to demand it. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and went back to stacking firewood. There was no urgency on my end. Urgency favors whoever feels cornered, and that wasn't me. That evening, a neighbor approached while I was fixing a loose board on the dock. Middle-aged, polite, nervous. He apologized for the situation and explained that things had gotten out of hand. He mentioned her name carefully, like it might bite him. He said she had a habit of handling things herself, and that most people just went along with it to avoid conflict. I thanked him for the honesty and told him I planned to keep the cabin exactly as it was. No development. No changes. Just ownership. Relief crossed his face before he realized that ownership alone was the problem she'd never been able to tolerate. The following Monday, the community liaison requested a meeting again, this time offering legal counsel on their side. That was the moment everything crystallized. When people bring lawyers to conversations they claim are friendly, it's because they've already lost ground and want to stop the bleeding. My attorney responded with a single paragraph. All future communication would be handled formally. Any continued interference, false reporting, or misrepresentation of authority would be documented and addressed accordingly. No threats. No emotion. Just structure. The silence that followed lasted 3 days. Then came the apology. Not from her, but from the association. A general statement acknowledging missteps, affirming my legal ownership, and requesting cooperation moving forward. Her name wasn't mentioned, but her influence was gone. Informally, I learned she'd been removed from any role involving complaints or external contact. Liability has a way of clarifying leadership decisions. When I finally saw her again, she was different. No confidence. No audience. She stood at a distance, pretending to admire the lake while clearly watching me. The woman who had sent police to evict me now avoided even eye contact. Authority, once challenged and exposed, rarely survives intact. The cabin settled into routine. Mornings on the dock, evenings by the fire. The lake stayed calm, indifferent to human ambition. And with every quiet day that passed, it became clearer that this outcome had never depended on who shouted the loudest or who knew the most people. It depended on who understood systems, boundaries, and patience. She had believed power was something you could borrow by calling it in. She learned instead that real power is usually quiet, procedural, and already in place long before anyone tries to take what isn't theirs. The final realization came quietly, the way most permanent lessons do. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic closing scene where anyone admitted defeat. Life at the lake simply resumed its natural rhythm, and in that calm, the truth settled in. The cabin was mine, unquestioned and unchallenged, not because I argued harder or knew the right people, but because I never needed to convince anyone in the first place. A week passed without a single call. Then another. The gravel road stayed empty. The shoreline remained untouched. No new notices appeared on the door. No neighbors hovered with forced smiles or half-formed suggestions. The systems she'd tried to weaponize against me had done what systems do when exposed to facts. They corrected themselves and moved on. One afternoon, while organizing the last of my uncle's belongings, I found a small envelope tucked inside a book on the shelf. Inside was a handwritten note, dated years earlier. It was short, almost casual. He wrote that people would eventually assume the cabin had no owner, and when they did, they would test it. He reminded me not to mistake testing for authority. Let them reveal themselves, he'd written. Paper outlasts noise. That note explained everything. The silence. The preparation. The patience. He hadn't been avoiding conflict. He'd been outlasting it. I thought back to the moment she stood behind the officers, so certain that the uniforms meant control had already shifted. I understood now that she'd never expected resistance that didn't look like resistance. She'd expected shouting, pleading, bargaining, something she could push against. What she got instead was compliance with the process, and that gave her nothing to grip. People like her depend on reactions. They depend on urgency. They thrive in moments where others feel uncertain and exposed. Take that away, and there's nothing left but frustration and risk. And risk is something they avoid once it becomes personal. The cabin became what it was always meant to be. A place of quiet. A place where the lake dictated the pace, not personalities. I fixed what needed fixing, left untouched what didn't, and respected the land the way my uncle had. Ownership, I learned, isn't about asserting control. It's about responsibility and restraint. Occasionally, I'd see her across the water or along the road. No words passed between us. None were needed. The distance itself was the resolution. Whatever story she told herself afterward didn't matter. The outcome was documented, settled, and permanent. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd called the police believing authority arrived with flashing lights. What she learned instead was that real authority rarely announces itself. It sits in file cabinets, recorded deeds, quiet signatures, and the discipline to wait while others expose their intentions. Standing on the dock one evening, watching the sun drop behind the trees, I felt grateful, not for the conflict, but for the clarity it forced. The inheritance wasn't just property. It was perspective. A lesson in how power actually works, and how easily it collapses when challenged by patience and proof. The lake didn't care who thought they belonged there. The land didn't recognize entitlement. And neither did the law. In the end, that was all that mattered.